Well, yes, thank you all so much for coming, for being here at the Swedish Institute of International Affairs. 2 weeks ago, the Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit returned home after 5 years in captivity in Gaza, and 4 months, sorry. He was released in a prisoner swap with over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. 477 have been released so far, and within 2 months the rest will be released. It was the first time actually that Hamas and Israel could reach some kind of negotiation and then reach an agreement, and even if it was indirectly. 2 men had tried for many years to reach a deal, and that's Ghazi Hanna in Gaza, and Hamas official who used to be the spokesperson actually for Hamas and for Ismail Haniyeh, the prime minister in Gaza, and Dr. Gershon Baskin, sitting here in Stockholm today, Israeli peace activist, but most of all director and the founder of Israel Palestine Center for Research and Information, an Israeli think tank. Israeli-Palestinian think tank devoted to the peace process that is then run jointly by Israelis and Palestinians, and well connected to Israel and Palestinian decision making, obviously, or apparently. So first of all, you will have a lot of time to ask your questions eventually, but first we just would like to have sort of an account of what the process, not your personal, but you know, like he was captured, what happened, I mean, behind the scenes during that time.
I think, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for coming, and thank you for bringing me. A couple of pre-words. I never knew that I was going to be a negotiator with Hamas, and I never knew that I would be negotiating for a prisoner exchange of terrorists who had killed Israelis. And I never knew that I would find myself moving from being a peace activist for 30 years, today thought of in Israel to be on the extreme left, even though that's an incorrect characteristic, but that's how the peace camp is thought of, to overnight finding myself in the heart of the Israeli consensus. There has not been an event, probably since 1974, when Israel flew into Entebbe and rescued a plane load of people who had been hijacked by Palestinian terrorists. There has not been an event in Israel of which 90% of the Israeli public has supported. I get stopped in the street today by people who come and hug me and thank me. People of all walks of life, and interviewed in ultra-Orthodox newspapers and even on the Settlers radio station as a hero. So it's quite a new position for me to be in. I'm a celeb, as they say in Israel. But this all started for me with a very sad event. In September of 2005, one of my wife's first cousins disappeared. He had a small business in which he bought and sold equipment for restaurants, and he had a lot of contacts in the West Bank with Palestinians. He's originally from Iraqi origin and spoke fluent Arabic. And I was at a conference in Switzerland, and I got a phone call from my wife who told me that the family is looking for Sasson. Sasson Noriel was his name. He disappeared, and they wanted to use my contacts with Palestinians to see if we could find him. I picked up the phone and I called my Palestinian partner, Mr. Hanna Senora, who's also well known here in Sweden. And Hanna went to Ramallah and met with the Palestinian police and the Palestinian security forces and couldn't find anything. No one knew what happened to Sasson Noriel. 3 or 4 days later, a videotape was issued with Sasson handcuffed, blindfolded, obviously had been tortured, he was bleeding. He had been captured by Hamas, and he was ordered by the Hamas captors on this videotape to issue demands for an Israeli release of Palestinian prisoners. About 5 days later, his body had been discovered. He was brutally murdered. He was butchered with a butcher knife. Horrible killing. I, at that point, felt so terrible that first I was away when it happened. When I came back, we tried to find him, and I couldn't do anything to save my wife's cousin. And I made a commitment to myself that if ever anyone ever turns to me to help find someone and save a life, that I would do everything that I could to make that happen. A few months later, in December of 2005, I was attending a conference of the Mediterranean Development Forum in Cairo. I think I was the only Israeli at that conference. I was approached by a friend from Gaza who wanted to introduce me to someone, and he said, Professor M, I'm not giving his name in order to protect him because later something happened to him. Professor M was a professor of economics at the Islamic University of Gaza, who had come from Gaza to Cairo to meet an Israeli. He had heard that there might be Israelis at this conference. He was a member of Hamas, and we were introduced. He, for me, was the first person from Hamas I had ever talked to, and I've been talking to Palestinians for 30 years. He was the first person from Hamas I ever talked to. I was the first Jew that he had ever met. We excused ourselves from the conference and spent about 6 hours in dialogue. It was fascinating. It was a kind of déjà vu. It reminded me of conversations that I had with PLO people 25 years ago who didn't recognize Israel and didn't recognize the Jews as a people, and it was fascinating. And we both decided that this conversation had value and we should try to expand it. So we agreed we would try to create a dialogue, a secret, discreet dialogue between Hamas academics and Israeli academics. Well, it never worked because the Hamas political level vetoed these talks. But over a period of months, including a trip that I made to Gaza to the Islamic University to meet some of his colleagues, developed a relationship between the two of us. On June 25th, 2006, attack took place at the Kerem Shalom army base on the Israeli side of the Gaza border. Fighters came up through a tunnel into the army base, attacked a tank, killed 2 soldiers, and walked off with another soldier. It took about an hour before the Israelis discovered that a soldier had been kidnapped, Gilad Shalit. 3 days later, Professor M called me and said, Gershon, we're being bombed, we have no water, we have no electricity, my children are screaming, everyone's afraid, we need to do something. And I said, what can we do? He said, I don't know, but we need to open a line of conversation. Now, I've had a principle in my whole life. I'm willing to talk to anyone who's willing to talk to me, including, of course, people who don't even recognize my right to exist. So he went to the office of Prime Minister Haniya, the Hamas Prime Minister, and half an hour later I got a phone call from the director of the office, Dr. Mohammed Madhoun, who told me that in a little while someone else would be calling me and he would be my liaison to Hamas. About half an hour later, Dr. Razi Hamad called me. Razi was the spokesperson of the Hamas government. Razi was in the inner circle of Sheikh Ahmed Yassin, the founder of Hamas. He was one of Ahmed Yassin's boys. He had a group of young, intelligent people with whom he formed and developed the movement, and Razi Hamad was one of those people. And after they won the elections, he became the spokesperson of the government. Razi had been the editor of the Hamas newspaper, El Risali, The Message, an intellectual, person who's a veterinarian by training, but became a politician from his work. Razi had suggested that day that we open up a line of communication, and perhaps if I could get in touch with the soldier's father, he would speak to him and perhaps the Prime Minister would speak to him. It took me about 2 hours to find the telephone number of Noam Shalit, and I spoke to Noam and asked him, would you be willing to speak to these Hamas people? He said, of course. I have to find out. My son is alive, what happened to him, how we can get him back. Later that afternoon, a conversation took place between Noam Shalit and Razi Hamad, but it was still very unclear how to progress, because for one, it was unclear who was holding the soldier. There were at least 3 different Palestinian groups who took responsibility for the attack and the kidnapping, and it wasn't clear who was in charge. This took about another 3 weeks before we knew who was in charge. And at that point, it seemed clear to me that in order to open up a channel of communication, we had to, 1, establish that the soldier was alive, and 2, we had to establish that whoever I was talking to could produce the goods at the end of the day. They were the people holding the soldier. I also needed to contact the Prime Minister's office. This was quite difficult. We're now 3 or 4 weeks into the kidnapping. We have a war in Lebanon. 2 Israeli soldiers were kidnapped by Hezbollah and dragged off to Lebanon. Israel went to war in Lebanon. Israel's attack, which they called summer rain, was waging on in Gaza. At this point, by the time the war in Lebanon had started, already 150 Palestinians in Gaza had been killed in the Israeli attack and the attempt of Israel to locate the soldier and to bring him out in a military operation. There was no way that I could possibly pick up the phone and call the Prime Minister and say, I have a message to you from Hamas. So I thought, how can I get a message to him? Well, a couple of months before, a young woman named Dana Olmert, the daughter of the Prime Minister, is a well-known peace activist, had participated in a demonstration in front of the home of the person who was then commander of the Israeli Air Force. The commander of the Air Force had been asked by a member of the press, what does it feel like when you drop a 1-ton bomb on a Palestinian house and kill 19 innocent people? This is an event that had really happened. Israel had killed one of the leaders of the military wing of Hamas, and the collateral damage was that 19 people were killed. Well, the head of the Israeli Air Force, who later became the chief of staff, Dani Chalutz, responded, I feel a little bump on the wing of my plane. So there was a demonstration of peace activists that took place in front of his house, and Dana Olmert, the daughter of the Prime Minister, had attended the demonstration. And she was naturally attacked in the press and by politicians. I found her email, and I sent her an email of encouragement and told her that she should stand up for her principles and she shouldn't be intimidated. And this opened up a contact between Dana Olmert and myself. And when I needed to deliver messages to the Prime Minister, I picked up the phone and called her, and I asked her, would you be willing to be a conduit to send messages to the Hamas, from the Hamas to your father? And she said, of course. She also said, I have to caution you. I know my father's opinions, he won't listen. And the first message that we transferred to her father, his response was, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We know he's alive, and we hold the Hamas responsible. I went back to Razi Hamad and picked up the phone and called him. I said, Razi, we have to open up this formal chain of communication, and you have to provide a sign of life. Razi came back to me after consulting the people from the military wing of Hamas and said, 350 women and minor prisoners in exchange for a videotape. I communicated this message to Dana Olmert, who went to her father, who came back to me and said, we don't negotiate with terrorists. We know he's alive. We hold Hamas responsible, and we don't pay anything for information. Well, this went on for a number of weeks until I got very frustrated and thought that I would engage the PLO, Abu Mazen, President Abbas, and I went one Friday morning to Ramallah, to Abu Mazen's office, and I was told to meet with one of the advisors, and we picked up a phone from Abu Mazen's office and called Razi Hamad and conducted a negotiation that went on for about 2 hours, at which time the Hamas agreed to the following. They said, we'll take 1 busload of women and children prisoners, minors, and they agreed that the bus would be delivered to the Muqatta, to the headquarters of Abu Mazen in Ramallah, so that he could take the credit. And I picked up the phone at that point and called Olmert's chief of staff, who was on the phone with Elliot Abrams, the national security advisor in the United States, working out the negotiations for the UN ceasefire in Lebanon. He picked up the phone, I called him on his cell phone, I hear him negotiating with Elliot Abrams, and he put the phone down and took him about 15 minutes before he came back to me. But the answer was the same. We don't negotiate with terrorists. We know he's alive. We don't pay anything for information. I was completely frustrated at this point, and I traveled to Gaza. I had a press card. I could go into Gaza. I met with Razi Hamad, and Razi and I, and this is a crucial development here, Razi and I put our heads together and came up with a solution. This was actually the first time that we had met face to face. But the nature of our relationship, as it had already been developed in phone calls and SMSs almost every day, was that we decided we had a problem that we had to solve, and we worked together as a joint problem-solving team. And the idea that I came up with and he liked and supported was that we would ask the kidnappers to provide a handwritten letter from the soldier without a price. Razi liked the idea. He told me to wait in Gaza. I waited in Gaza until dark, and then I left. The next day or 2 days later, Razi called me and said there's a letter on the way. But the letter never came. The letter was supposed to be delivered to the representative office of the Egyptian government in Gaza, and it never came. And a day went by, and another day, and a week, and 2 weeks. And I'm calling Razi 15 times a day, and my wife is telling me, he's lying to you. How can you trust him? Then we figured out that the political echelon in Syria, the political leadership of Hamas, stopped the letter. There had actually been a letter, and it was stopped on the way to the Egyptians. So I called up the soldiers' parents, Noam and Aviva Shalit, and met with them, and suggested that Noam Shalit write a letter, father to father, and that we write the letter to Khalid Mashal, the head of the Hamas Politburo in Damascus. And I got Khalid Mashal's phone number and fax number and his email address. And Noam wrote a very good letter. He consulted with an Arab friend, and they took quotes from the Quran about what Islam says about prisoners and the treatment of prisoners and about being a father. And the letter was sent off, and we verified that Khalid Mashal got the letter. And 2 days later, on Saturday morning, September 9th, 2006, at 11 o'clock in the morning, Razi Hamid called me and said, the letter was just delivered, the letter from the soldier was just delivered to the Egyptian office in Gaza. I picked up the phone and called Noam Shalit and said, we have a sign of life from Gilad. I picked up the phone and called the person who had just recently, a week before, been appointed by Prime Minister Olmert to be his envoy for dealing with the kidnapped soldiers, the 2 in Lebanon and Gilad Shalit, and informed them that there was a letter. He verified it with the Egyptian office in Gaza and then called me and said, Gershon, thank you very much for all you've done. You're now out of the picture. We have an official channel through the Egyptians. We are negotiating at official levels now. If you have messages and ideas that you would like to transmit to me, feel free to do that, but you're out of the picture. I picked up the phone and called the intelligence officer at the Israeli embassy at the time, General Nader Asser. Nader had been living in Israel for a long time, was a well-known intelligence officer, had a lot of good relations with Israel. I had known him from before, and I called up Nader. I wanted to tell him what had been developed because the person in Gaza was handling the negotiations, not Nader at that point. We met in Jerusalem, and Nader told, after listening to the story, Nader said to me, Gershon, don't listen to Ofer Dekel, the person who had been appointed by the Prime Minister. Ofer Dekel came from the Shin Bet. He said, don't listen to him. We need a free agent who can pass messages, who's not part of the establishment, who can come up with ideas, so keep doing what you're doing. Make sure to inform me what you're doing, but keep doing what you're doing. And I decided to listen to Nader al-Asser and not to Ofer Dekel. This went on for a long period of time. There were 2 periods during the regime of Olmert before he was forced to resign, when at one point Hamas had presented the idea of a secret direct back channel to negotiate, and I passed the message on to Ofer Dekel, and at that point Olmert rejected it. About half a year later, Ofer Dekel called me and wanted me to present the idea to Hamas of a secret direct back channel, but then Hamas rejected it. At the end of the Olmert government, a German mediator was brought into the picture, Dr. Gerhard Konrad, an official of the German intelligence, who had a lot of experience working in the Middle East and speaks Arabic and is an expert of Islam. And he actually produced an agreement with Hezbollah that brought about a prisoner release and the return of, unfortunately, 2 dead Israeli soldiers who they had cynically held in ransom all the time, knowing that they were dead, keeping the families with the belief that their sons were alive. But Gerhard Konrad had succeeded in negotiating, and he continued with Hamas, but he came up with a dead end with Hamas. The process ended at that point when the Olmert government left.